So, it's been about 2 weeks since we've spoken. See, I decided to take a bit of time off because of burnout, but I'm ready to tell the next part of this grand tale. This one took the longest to put together, as it took the longest to record. See, the first video covers 13 years of gameplay. The second video covers 10 years. The video you are watching now covers 25 years of gameplay. This is easily the longest part yet. It may just be the longest part of the campaign. I'm excited to tell you what happened, but first of all, I'd like to recap what happened in parts 1 and 2. And of course, I'd like to explain what's happened between the last part and the current video. If you want to skip to today's content, here's a timestamp. Now, let me explain. Before the Soviet Union formed, we had the Russian Empire. It was an antiquated, archaic autocracy that was utterly miserable to live in outside of 1 or 2 cities. Industrialization was going at a snail's pace, and at a horrible time too, as tensions in Europe were at an all-time high. It all culminated in the Great War when the Austro-Hungarian Empire invaded the Russian Empire's ally of Serbia. The war lasted 4 years, and in that time, the working class had enough of the empire's bullcrap. The Bolsheviks, led by Comrade Lenin, stormed Winter Palace and established the Russian Soviet Republic. However, the capitalists rallied around Admiral Kolchak in Siberia, causing the Russian Civil War. Luckily, being in control of a heaping majority of Russia's industry and population gave us a massive advantage. All of that on top of fighting for a single cause, unlike the politically divided whites, led to Kolchak being executed and the Russian state surrendering. After reconquering lost land in the West, we set down our arms and officially proclaimed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In 1924, Comrade Lenin passed away, and our current leader, Joseph Stalin, took his place. He rules with an iron fist, but it has had massive benefits as the motherland was massively industrialized under him, and now the Soviet industrial base is comparable to that of America. However, the industrialization only went into overdrive in the late 1930s, when tensions in Europe had reached new heights. The National Socialist German Reich was preparing to invade most of Europe to fulfill Adolf Hitler's policy of Lebensraum, or, in other words, he was preparing to kill any non-German he found. At first, we worked with him. However, we knew it was only a matter of time before Hitler turned his guns towards us and invaded our great union. Sure enough, the Axis powers launched Operation Barbarossa and pushed us back very far into our union. In the end, the Axis overstretched itself, so we launched a series of small counterattacks before launching a full invasion of Germany itself. The Western allies were deeply incompetent, so it ended up being us who liberated most of Europe. We had to bail out the Allies and the Chinese United Front too, as they were struggling heavily to defeat the Empire of Japan. After we occupied the Japanese holdings in mainland Asia, we dropped a nuke on Hiroshima. After using the landing made by the Allies, who, by the way, did not bother exploiting their landing, we occupied Japan, ending the Great Patriotic War. In the end, a new world order was created. The world was now divided into 2 blocks, the capitalist bloc and the Soviet bloc. Both sides have different plans for the future of the world, but with the USSR emerging as the first nuclear power and USA following soon after, a new world war was very unappealing. A Cold War would begin. Now that you're caught up, let's briefly discuss what happened between this video and the last one. This time there isn't much time in between, so there isn't much to discuss, but let's still talk. During the Great Patriotic War, Xinjiang had left the Chinese United Front in a separate peace with Japan and joined the Common Form. In 1947, we opted to turn Xinjiang over to Mao Zedong's forces, who promptly reorganized it into the People's Republic of Xinjiang, which would later be directly annexed. The British had also begun working on slowly decolonizing, as they no longer had the funds to maintain their colonial empire. France, however, would fight tooth and nail to keep their colonies like the dirty imperialists they are. However, the biggest development came in April 1949. The Western powers formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO. If our suspicions are correct, NATO is a fiercely anti-Soviet bloc that exists to challenge communism and our union. Furthermore, it may be actively out to destroy us. We must be wary of the West at all times and ensure that we counter it whenever we can. That brings us to today. The atomic age is upon us. As both blocs of the world develop their nuclear arsenals, thus making a new war highly unappealing, a new period of coldness towards each other begins. Let's get started. China's civil war is still ongoing. but the nationalists have lost a lot of important land to the People's Liberation Army. By Stalin's order, we sent a tank expeditionary force to assist the Chinese as best as we could. However, Mao was way stronger than I was expecting. By the time our tanks arrived at the pocket we were going to clear out, Mao had beaten us to the punch. We kept our tanks in China to help wherever we could, but our help was largely unneeded. In West Germany, they were having elections. I tried interfering with them to maybe make West Germany flip to communism, but those efforts ended up yielding no results. However, I thought we could do something about Greece, which has been in a civil war for some time now. We tried to support the Greek communists with equipment and a volunteer division, but they surrendered soon after. This is also when I designed a tank template I would use for the rest of the video. I designed it originally with the plan of using it as my only template, but eventually decided against that, and instead I thought I would use these tanks as my volunteer divisions. However, later on I ended up developing Mountaineers, which took up the role of the tanks, which ended up mostly sitting in East Germany for most of the video. We also finished up some stuff from the Great Patriotic War. We put members of the Japanese Kwantung Army on trial to get them convicted of war crimes committed during the war. We also destroyed the Ukrainian insurgent army. Although they did fight back against the Germans during the war, they are not our allies. They want an independent Ukraine, which obviously we are opposed to. However, they died in one decision, so they were just a complete non-issue. Just then, we got the news that the Kuomintang had been forced to retreat its leadership to the island of Taiwan, after the mainland was largely overwhelmed by the People's Liberation Army under Mao Zedong's leadership. We also decided to step up our involvement in Vietnam, as the colony was currently experiencing a communist revolt led by Ho Chi Minh. The French, being capitalist imperialists as always, were refusing to work with the locals and were trying to put down the revolt. We must make sure that communism thrives in Vietnam to show that colonialism can and will become a thing of the past. Anti-imperialism is only going to continue to thrive in Asia, as the communists in China officially declared victory in the Chinese Civil War after the nationalists lost everything on the mainland. However, for now, Mao has no way of reaching Taiwan. However, the KMT has no chance of returning to the mainland, so it's still definitely a communist victory. The right KMT under Chiang Kai-shek will bow to the CPC and their collaborators in the left KMT one day. For now, they get to live. We were swift to recognize the new communist government of China, and we made sure to do some stuff to assist them in securing their government in an act of solidarity. It is very important for communists to work together against the capitalists who seek to destroy us. Our infiltration efforts in West Germany ended up failing, but that's irrelevant as we managed to secure an official friendship treaty with China. The USSR and China being officially friends will rock the Western world in ways they could never imagine. With friendship with China established, we could also officially recognize Vietnam as an independent nation. The Viet Minh is currently leading an insurrection against the French colonialists, and we must assist our brothers in liberating themselves from France. Back in Europe, we began spreading communist influence in Finland. See, we did fight Finland during the Great Patriotic War, but decided to sign a quick peace with them so we could fully focus on fighting the Nazis. We could just walk right in and they couldn't stop us now, but we believe it's better to subvert Finnish politics and influence them until we can establish a dependent state that we can later annex. We also decided to formally end the occupation of East Germany, and formally establish the German Democratic Republic. Letting Germany hold on to Pomerania and Silesia was the right call, because without it, the new GDR has no chance of standing up to the Federal Republic of Germany. We began looking into this new thing that was just invented. Helicopters. They're much more for utility than anything, but they're highly promising. We hope to add rockets onto them at some point, so we can use them to support our forces in battle. Artillery is great, but death from above is even better. But that's for the future. For now, we focus on rebuilding the Union from the damage of the Great Patriotic War. Reconstruction was ongoing in Ukraine, and we were putting money into developing the Baltic states. We needed to invest into them to keep the territories loyal, as we did quite forcefully integrate them into the Union. Back in 1944, we signed up percentage agreements with the British. These essentially divided the Balkans between spheres of influence. See, the Greek Civil War posed an opportunity for us to break the agreements. If the communists won, we would have gained a supermajority over the region, and we could have spread communism to Turkey without issue. However, because the communists surrendered, we have to work within the percentage agreements. Luckily, this doesn't stop us from embargoing Yugoslavia, who went fascist during the Great Patriotic War. The tanks I designed earlier were being deployed slowly but surely, but they simply took too long. For this reason, I decided we should just bite the bullet and go with a standard infantry army as our main forces. We would end up having the biggest infantry army in the world. Our work in Finland was going smoothly. Not only were we manipulating their politics, we had even gotten enough political influence in Finland to establish a dependent state. However, we couldn't just yet because we needed more political power. You need 500 political power to officially establish a dependent state. While waiting, we got the news that the British were officially the third nuclear power, having now achieved nuclear weaponry. There's no doubt that the British were just one of many powers now aiming to achieve nuclear weapons. We believe France and China are also looking into them, and both of them are more than capable of achieving such devices. Then, as fate would have it, two governments would be hit with a coup. The Free Officers movement in Egypt would stage a coup, formally ending the monarchy. Next, we finally pulled the trigger on Finland and eradicated their capitalist Nazi-sympathetic government, making it a Soviet puppet state. Finland was merely a loose end from the Great Patriotic War. Remember, the only reason we accepted their conditional peace was because we needed everything on the front line with Germany. Now that we were at peace, it was the right time to subvert Finnish politics and coup their government. This is also important because by the end of the Great Patriotic War, Finland was the only part of the former Russian Empire to not be part of the Union. Soon enough, they'll be fully brought back into the fold. Now that Finland is handled, I moved my attention to Yugoslavia, aiming to coup their fascist regime. I didn't realize though that you needed a much stronger GDP to do that to Yugoslavia, so I wasted a lot of political power on them. Interestingly, despite the monarchy being overthrown, the Egyptians still managed to get a deal with the British, and Anglo-Egyptian Sudan was partitioned. Egypt annexed the north while the south became independent. The American election of 1952 also happened. Despite the election looking promising for Republican candidate Eisenhower, Estes Kefauver managed to secure the mandate, becoming the new president of the United States. Certainly not what we were expecting. Though, being a sovereign Democrat, we can only make guesses as to what his plans for the country are. We ourselves believe to be doing just fine politically as the 19th Congress of the Communist Party was underway. The outcome would be crucial, as it would decide what path the Soviet Union would take in the future. A lot of people were calling for the eradication of Lavrenti Beria's clique, but there was a growing paranoia that doctors in the Union were using their positions to secretly harm important politicians after being bribed by the West. As such, doctors were purged instead of Beria and his gang. We did try working with the West a bit, despite their blatant hostility showcased by the US pledging to defend Taiwan. We sent a proposal to the West, suggesting we create a united but neutral German state. See, the US was actually on board with this plan, and so was East Germany. The reason it failed? West Germany completely refused. This is what spelled it out for us that West Germany cannot be trusted, and the GDR is the only rightful government of Germany. Sadly, our union would lose its great leader in 1953. Stalin passed away after his best doctors were purged, and the remaining few were terrified they would be next, so nobody helped him in his final moments. Furthermore, it was not immediately obvious who would succeed Stalin, since there were multiple candidates. The Union itself will survive, but we need to end this leadership crisis before the West can exploit it. Ironically enough, not long after Stalin died, we could officially annex Finland into the Union. It's too bad our fallen leader died just before the last renegade state of Russia could be brought back into the fold. The reformists were by now the dominant clique in the Soviet Union, with Georgy Malenkov being chosen as a provisional leader, while the Politburo and the Presidium focused on choosing a new leader. Malenkov decided it was important to cancel a lot of Stalin's big projects, as he and other reformists in the USSR believed Stalin was a tyrant, and that the Union needed to undergo de-Stalinization. Stalin also ended ties with Israel, but Malenkov opted to reopen the Israeli embassy. We also used this downtime to design our primary special forces unit. I went with mountaineers, as I believed they could navigate complex terrain better than my tanks could. Later on, I added attack helicopters to these mountaineers, and they became almost unstoppable. Within the Soviet Union, the head of the secret police, Lavrenti Beria, believed he was the only right choice to succeed Stalin. To avoid suspicion, he positioned himself as a reformer like that of Malenkov and Khrushchev. He used his position as head of the NKVD to issue an arrest warrant for Stalin's youngest child, Vasily Stalin. He was able to get the MBD and MGB to be merged into one entity under the guise of simplifying Soviet bureaucracy, when really it was just to give him more power. The Presidium did try to counter Beria's influence, but he was very well known by now, so he could use his power to delay their countermeasures to his plans. Beria was only a reformist on the surface. He discreetly halted the radical reforms that Malenkov and Khrushchev were trying to push through. Furthermore, he was able to stop people from accusing him of treason by pledging his full allegiance to the Presidium. Beria, being the head of Soviet intelligence, knew that Malenkov and Khrushchev didn't agree on everything, so he used that information to turn the two of them against each other and prevent them from agreeing on anything. The Troika was struggling to make decisions, but it could agree on sending 5 mountaineer divisions to assist the rebels in the Belgian Congo. We need to destroy colonialism at every opportunity. This expedition would be harder than I thought though, because the Congo rebels have no fucking units. So we decided we would carry the Congo to victory if we had to. We swiftly eliminated the Rwanda-Burundi government and tried to refocus to the Western Front. I did notice that there was another revolt in the Congo, so I tried to send them volunteers too, but they told me to get lost. Assholes. While the power struggle was going on, other political developments around the world were happening. Vietnam had achieved independence, but sadly it was split into two. The North will be led by the communist Ho Chi Minh, who we obviously recognized. The South, though, is a neo-fascist regime backed by corporate figureheads and the United States, who must be stopped. We also got the news that Mongolia's request to become an SSR had been rejected. Maybe I'm a bit crazy, but I have the feeling they asked the wrong person or something, because I got no events about Mongolia wanting to join a union. Not sure what happened, honestly. Back on the home front, Beria decided it would be best to cautiously support de-Stalinization. In truth, he admired Stalin's style of leadership, but he realized that the Union had gone in a reformist direction, so he pretended to support it. What he did do, though, was claim that the Presidium would inevitably melt down. He was actually correct in that regard, as the failure to immediately re-establish stable leadership was definitely noticed by anyone with a brain. Beria met with Comrade Zhukov, hero of the Great Patriotic War. He promised Zhukov the position of Minister of Defense if he supported Beria as the new leader of the Soviet Union. This offer was accepted, though Beria was wary of Zhukov's influence as he had become very popular and well known in the USSR since the Great Patriotic War. Finally, it was time for the last step of Beria's plan to assume full power over the Soviet Union. He issued arrest warrants for several opposing members of the Communist Party. The opposition was crippled, and Malenkov and Khrushchev were ousted from any kind of leadership role. Beria declared a permanent state of emergency, assuming full power over the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. To ensure his arrested opponents had no chance of overthrowing him, he had them go through show trials and later be executed. Beria had now more or less secured his position as the new leader of the Soviet Union. He only needed the 20th Congress of the Communist Party to officially lock down his rule. While he waited, our infrastructure was able to be fully modernized. Nobody can rightly complain about better infrastructure. That's why when the 20th Congress did come around, Beria's rule was fully solidified, as he was able to replace Foreign Minister Molotov with Kosygin. The Politburo was also reshuffled with politicians that supported Beria. Hardliner members of the party were also purged. Now, Beria could carry out his ambitions with nothing stopping him. While the USSR itself was now stabilized, our vassal state of Hungary was most certainly not. The Hungarian Revolution had unfolded, and the Hungarians were trying to become a neutral communist state. Hungary's situation was spiraling out of control, and countries were noticing. Beria demanded that the tanks be ready to restore order in Hungary. Mao Zedong of China sent us a telegram begging us not to intervene and to let the change happen. Absolutely fucking not. If we let Hungary go, the entirety of the Eastern Bloc would buckle. Soviet tanks promptly stormed Budapest, reaffirming full Soviet dominance. The whole event would come to be known as the Hungarian tragedy, which caused fear of the USSR to rise in the West. Hungary isn't the only communist government with massive political change, though. In Korea, the Kim dynasty, as people called it, was ousted from power. They were the most totalitarian rulers in history of the planet. So they were largely hated by not just the West, but people within the communist world. While that was going on, we were undergoing our own political reforms. By that, I mean we were just annihilating our opposition. We incriminated Molotov and framed Voroshilov's associates. These guys really weren't relevant anymore, but they were the most significant since Malenkov and Khrushchev mysteriously vanished. We'd rather be safe than sorry. We got the news that Joseph Martin had been elected as the new US president. Republicans are typically much more aggressive towards communism, so we need to be wary. Beria had a very interesting idea. He had envisioned a sort of pan-European union that would bind European economies together, keeping the continent economically stable. However, he first needed to help the Eastern Bloc to make the promises of a European Union seem appealing to the West too. We assisted Bulgaria's agriculture industry, began Comecon integration, financed Hungary's aviation program, initiated a joint Czechoslovak-Soviet automobile venture, and developed East Germany's chemical industry. This will all help to make the idea of a European Union appealing to the West. And if they do join us, then tensions will cool down. I got the news that Egypt had seized control of the Suez Canal from the British. The Suez Canal is one of the most important waterways for trade, so the sudden seizure of the canal is huge. There's no way the British take this sitting down. While we waited for the British to respond to Egypt's actions, we were busy engaging in diplomacy with Europe. We were focused on trying to improve relations with Western Europe to get them interested in a European Union, while also trying to mediate a peace treaty in Indochina to end the whole North and South Vietnam thing. Just then, Israel launched an invasion of the Sinai Peninsula with British and French support. This is a blatant act of imperialism, so we tried sending Egypt volunteers, but they declined. They still accepted equipment though. Despite Israel overrunning Egypt's valuable land, somehow the war was still an Egyptian victory? I'm not sure how that works, but I trust you. Relations with the West had somewhat improved. We proposed creating a unified Deutschmark zone. In other words, we're going to try to get the two German governments to use a single currency. Both sides actually accepted, so this actually worked out. At this point, the US has been trying to overthrow North Vietnam's regime through direct military action. To stop them, we've sent 3 mountaineers to hold back the Yankee naval landings. For now, we've held them back just fine. We prepared an inter-European investment plan to increase the output of European economies. This was largely to make Europe's people see the USSR as the superpower that cares for Europe's working class, not America. As a gesture of goodwill to the West, we even forced our satellites in Eastern Europe to limit their military spending. Next, we suggested we demilitarize the border between the two Germanys. The US and East Germany were on board with it, but West Germany declined. We're not surprised, honestly. We already knew West Germany couldn't be trusted. Regardless, Beria came to the conclusion that now is the right time to form the Pan-European Union. He wanted it to bring not just the Eastern Bloc's economies together, but also bring Western Europe's economies into the fold to undermine American economic control. Surprisingly, when we announced it, all invitees accepted. Now all of Europe is in the European Union. This is a huge diplomatic victory for the USSR, as it hurts American economic influence on the continent, now that its allies' economies are somewhat intertwined with ours. Something to note about Beria's path in this mod is that it deliberately doesn't give you a lot of political power. Because of that, we don't have enough to do to focus to officially declare the great Soviet rebirth that Beria wanted. For a little while, we had to do 0 focuses so we could get more political power at a faster rate. While we were waiting, a new war began in the south. Persia had, for some reason, begun an invasion of Afghanistan. The current regime in Persia is a monarchist regime, led by the Shah, so this is undoubtedly imperialism. We sent material aid to Afghanistan to try our best to help them. They declined our volunteers, so we just kind of had to hope that our material aid could help them. Persia struggled hard to make progress, so we decided to take out their rage in Iraq, to which we also sent aid. However, this war ended up not ending in the way we expected. That's for later though. During this time, we got that 500 political power we needed to declare the Great Soviet Rebirth, so that's exactly what we did. The Soviet Union is reborn, as the line between the government and the KGB is blurred more and more. Beria's anti-criminal campaign eliminated more and more dissidents who would inevitably turn our union inside out. We punished them by reintroducing penal battalions in our army to build military infrastructure in return for little to no pay. Is it slavery? Maybe. Maybe not. Doesn't matter. Our union has been reborn, and under Beria, it has never been better. Back in Vietnam, new developments were unfolding. In South Vietnam, the National Liberation Front rose against South Vietnam. The National Liberation Front is just the Viet Cong's detachment in South Vietnam that allows for North Vietnam to subdue the South without directly invading. We must help the NLF, as they're our best shot at destroying the fascists in South Vietnam. We sent a Mountaineer Division to directly aid the NLF. I promptly began tunnel visioning on South Vietnam since the US was directly involved in the war now. Although I only had 1 volunteer division helping the NLF, we still made a big impact. We managed to split South Vietnam into 2 and promptly encircle and destroy 3 South Vietnamese units. Things got even better for us, as Laos directly joined the war on the side of the NLF, meaning we could clear out the north. This came at the right time because the NLF's regional capital of Kon Tum nearly fell to South Vietnam. Outside of Vietnam, we got the intriguing news of Mao Zedong offering elections to the Republic of China to decide on the future of the country, so the people could choose between the CPC and the KMT. I can't lie, I think it's a scam, but I can't prove it. Beria also decided to take Zhukov out back and take him out because, unlike Stalin, Beria actually knew how to get away with it. There was also a communist coup in Cuba, a small Caribbean nation, precisely in America's backyard. This will be important later. Even though our union is pretty thoroughly cleansed of enemies of Beria, he decided we needed a Stalinesque Great Purge to eliminate anyone the KGB even slightly suspected was a traitor. At this point, it's kind of overkill, but alright. The war between Persia and Afghanistan was still going on, so I decided to send 3 tanks to Afghanistan to try helping them out, only for them to later get worn down by attrition because of Afghanistan's dogshit geography and infrastructure. At this stage, we were multitasking. We were building up our own union while also trying to help other countries win their wars to varying degrees of success. However, we did notice that with everything that's happened, world tension had gotten really high, so we had to officially move to DEFCON 4. Interestingly, Yugoslavia actually supported my actions in Hungary. I'm not sure why, but there's probably a good reason for it. It's strange because Yugoslavia was fascist last we checked, but alright. Back in Vietnam, the war against South Vietnam ended as our Mountaineer division in the area single-handedly stormed the city of Saigon, causing South Vietnam to surrender. I assumed the war in Vietnam was firmly won with the fall of South Vietnam, so I stopped paying attention to them. I wasn't sure when Africa would decolonize, so for a while I hadn't been focused on the continent and was instead focusing on Vietnam, and working on public works and my agriculture. By the time I looked at Africa again, I found out that most of the continent had been decolonized. However, decolonization did not go smoothly. The Congo crisis had begun, as Katanga had broken off of the Congolese Republic. For some reason, I could send 9 full divisions to help the Congo. That's more than I was able to send to the NLF, but I'll take it. I sent 9 mountaineers to help the Congo put down Katanga. We focused primarily on capturing supply lines, but we didn't realize that the supply hubs out here didn't have any connection to the Congo's capital. So even if we did capture Katanga's supply hubs, it wouldn't really help our supply situation much. The Congo crisis only got worse, as Congolese officers in the north went rogue and took control of the area. We could only focus on one enemy at a time, so we decided we'd kill Katanga first. Luckily, the UN supported the Congo and not Katanga, so Katanga had essentially no backers. We managed to defeat Katanga so we could turn our mountaineers to the north to fight the rebellious officers. The chaos of the Congo had spread to other places in Africa though. The MPLA rose up against the Portuguese occupation of Angola. However, to help them, we needed to partake in an obtuse and, quite frankly, really poorly designed minigame, so we just didn't bother helping them. While finishing up in the Congo, we focused on warming relations with other Asian powers. We actually did partly repair our relations with China by renouncing our claims to some border territories. There's a lot of work to be done, but it's important to be on solid terms with the other major communist power in the world. Fighting in the Congo wasn't fun because of the terrible supply lines and infrastructure, but the northern rebels were incredibly weak. We eventually overwhelmed them with our elite mountaineer units, ending the Congo crisis. This is the outcome the United Nations wanted, so they truly have no right to complain about our intervention, which undoubtedly caused support for communism to rise in the Congo. I was still baffled by the event about Mongolia's annexation request being declined earlier, because I was never prompted about Mongolia wanting to be annexed. I'll have you know, I absolutely wanted to annex Mongolia. We first needed to get 90% influence in Mongolia, then spend 500 political power to turn them into a dependent state. That was going to take a while though, due to Beria's USSR having very little political power gain. We sent a mutual naval limitation treaty to the west to limit everyone's presence in the Pacific to cool down tensions, which surprisingly worked. This generally meant we didn't have to focus on the Pacific, which is great because we have no shot of standing up to the American Navy. I'd like to bring your attention back to that war in the Middle East. Persia had managed to annex Iraq, but Afghanistan is still holding out. Because of a recent Hoi 4 update, you can't just call back volunteers anymore. They're stuck there until either the war ends or until they die. The tanks I sent to Afghanistan had attrition so badly that they had become paperweights. I had no choice but to bite the bullet and delete those divisions and begin training replacements. It was then I realized that this was not a conflict that could be ended by aiding one side. No, this had only one way of being resolved. We are a superpower with possibly the biggest standing army in the world. We have the capability to end the war by directly intervening and ending Persia's attempt at forming a new Persian empire. So that's exactly what we will do. While we prepared to invade Persia, we created additional agencies for the European Union. We mostly expanded the Union's bureaucracy to account for all its members, but the main thing was the creation of the European Space Agency, which would be a united effort by all of Europe, regardless of ideology, to go to space. It does not matter if you're British, French, German, or Soviet. We will work together to go to conquer the stars. The preparations for Persia didn't take too long. We just moved our forces to the Persian border and drew up some battle plans. Once everything was in position, I just needed to wait for our justification on Persia to finish, which was relatively quick since we had a claim to northern Azerbaijan. Once we had the war goal, we wasted no time. We officially launched the invasion of Persia, beginning our first real war since the Great Patriotic War. Thankfully, despite the fact that it's been a while since the Union has raised its arms, the war went very well. Persia was actually already performing poorly against Afghanistan, so our intervention ended any hope they had of victory. We defeated Persia and managed to get full say in a peace conference. Iraq was liberated, and both it and Persia were turned into communist states under our guidance. Iran and Iraq weren't the only states liberated. In Yugoslavia, the fascist regime was officially overthrown by Tito. With the war over, we went back to just focusing on our union. We were now producing attack helicopters that we wanted to add on to our mountaineers to make them even stronger. It was going to be a while before we had enough, but it will be absolutely worth it to make our elite forces even better. We finished our agricultural reforms, so we switched our focus to cutting-edge technological developments. We were, of course, developing helicopters, which the US is also looking into. New everyday home life technology for the Soviet citizens is also being unveiled, while the US pours taxpayer dollars into the space race. Now, something is going to happen that's going to be the first risk of a third world war. See, a little while ago now, Fidel Castro staged a communist coup in Cuba. We welcomed Cuba to the communist world with open arms, while the US stared daggers into Cuba's back. For a while, this really didn't matter that much. However, recently we spotted American nuclear missiles stationed in Italy and Turkey. This is a huge threat to our existence, so we had to counter it somehow. Luckily, we have an ideological ally in Cuba who we can place nuclear missiles in. We began talks with Castro about it. He did put forward a counterproposal, but we insisted on placing our nuclear weapons in Cuba. In the end, Castro submitted and we could place our missiles in Cuba. However, the US found out about what we were doing. Unsurprisingly, they were going to use this as an excuse to launch an invasion of Cuba to depose Castro and stop us from placing our nukes in Cuba. This was serious because of the prospects of World War III. So secret talks began between us and the United States. We tried putting forward a counterproposal, but they declined. Then in another event, there was no text, but one of the options was to kill China for some reason, which made me laugh my ass off. Ultimately, I decided I wasn't ready to fight the West just yet, so I chose to leave Cuba to its fate. Sad, but this is not worth a world war. For a while I didn't have much to do because there was another focus that required 500 political power for it to be done. While I waited, I got the news of further liberalization of Korea. Although the Kim dynasty was out of power, the Juche did in fact remain. However, the Juche has now been overthrown and Korea is now pursuing more standard communism. This is great news, since a major source of American propaganda has just been lost. I know you're not meant to get a lot of political power as Beria's USSR, but I did not want to waste that much political power on annexing Mongolia, so I used my magic powers to suddenly get a lot of political power to work on annexing Mongolia. After using my magic powers to get more political power, I finally puppeted Mongolia. Soon, we can finally grant Mongolia that SSR status they have long awaited. We added those attack helicopters to the mountaineers at a good time because we got the news of a communist revolt against a Portuguese colony of Mozambique. This was a great opportunity to test the upgraded mountaineers, so we sent some mountaineer forces to Mozambique to help them achieve independence. When in action, it was clear to me that the attack helicopters were making an impact. We annexed Mongolia soon after, making them the final direct expansion of the video. We slowly but surely made gains in Mozambique, as the Portuguese simply stood no chance against our mountaineers. I had run out of focuses to do by now, so I had no issue with focusing on Mozambique. We managed to eliminate the final Portuguese forces in Mozambique, but there was no peace treaty, so for now we just have to wait until the Portuguese concede defeat. At this point, I came to the conclusion that it might be a good time to begin preparing for the Third World War. I know, I kind of cockblocked myself from further content by choosing Beria as Stalin's successor, but Still, obviously, because I ran out of content, it's not a good reason in-universe for World War III. So, Lavrenti Beria started experiencing paranoia just like Stalin did, but not because of the people within the Soviet Union, but because of the West. He's becoming increasingly paranoid of the West because intelligence reports from the KGB were suggesting that the United States would use any excuse it could get to directly destroy communism. They likely used our liberation of Persia as an excuse to invade Cuba, despite our cause for war being vastly different. Beria came to a conclusion that the Soviet Union and communism would always be under threat if America's power was unchecked. Someone needed to put America in their place. That someone would be us. Before we do go in on the West, I wanted to get helicopter units deployed. Yes, I was very satisfied with the attack helicopter support companies we put on the Mountaineers, but I also thought straight up helicopter forces would be very good. I wanted a lot, but they turned out to be pretty expensive. While I worked on those, I began influencing Saudi Arabia. See, one of the West's most significant sources of oil is Saudi Arabia. If we can steal their oil depot from them, they'll have to find other sources of oil, which is easier said than done. This would be even more problematic during wartime, so it's crucial we get the infiltration of Saudi Arabia done before we declare war on NATO. Then I got a news event that practically confirmed various suspicions about the West. Our hard work helping Vietnam become free from Western imperialism was all for nothing, as the US managed to re-establish the fascist Republic of Vietnam. The Vietnamese people have yet again been oppressed by the tyrants of the world. The fall of Vietnam to imperialism was a major blow, but we had a chance to make up for it when the Second Malayan Emergency began. The Malayan Communist Party had risen up once again, and we were going to support them to make up for the loss of Vietnam. We sent the Malayan Communists 2 Mountaineer units. Sadly, we lost one of the brave Mountaineer units in Malaysia, but we could train a replacement. Luckily, the loss of the 1 Mountaineer didn't stop our progress in Malaysia. We got encirclements and soon enough, all of Western Malaysia was under communist control. However, we couldn't move the Mountaineers to the east even though the communists controlled a port there. Luckily, using my magic powers, I can move the Mountaineers over. Right before my Mountaineers secured the victory in Malaysia, I got the news that Yugoslavia had become a nuclear power. Didn't realize they had that dog in them, but it's better to have them with us than against us. Anyway, we managed to carry the Malaysian communists to victory. Soon we had enough influence in Saudi Arabia. Now we just needed to wait a little while longer to pull the trigger and institute a communist takeover. In other news, at some point earlier, the United Arab Republic formed. I assumed it would only be a temporary measure, but it was not, as evidenced by Libya fully joining them. It seems like Arab unity is right around the corner. Considering it's being led by Nasser's Egypt, they can be considered an anti-imperialist friend. Eventually, we had the needed political power to destroy the House of Saud and form a communist Arabian state. Saudi Arabia is a very religious and conservative country though, so it's not guaranteed that the new communist Arabia will survive without us. Doesn't really matter. We also finally deployed our first 2 helicopter units. Interestingly, there was a fascist revolt in Croatia. We had units on standby at the Italian border so we could intervene immediately and put down the rebels without issue. I suspect this revolt was led by the old fascist government, who went into hiding after Tito staged a coup. Our preparations were finishing up. One of the last things we needed to do was withdraw from that Pacific Limitation Treaty that we were also the ones to put forward. Ironic. We also deployed our last helicopter unit. See, I wanted more, but that would be too expensive. 5 is enough anyway, they're not the main strike force anyhow. I came to the conclusion that we were ready to initiate World War III. I began justifying on West Germany. While I was doing that, I noticed that America under RFK had picked a really interesting time to end the draft. I thought they wouldn't do that with a hyper-militarized USSR on the border, but hey, it'll make humbling the United States a lot easier. Anyway, right before I declared war, I noticed that Italy had gone monarchist and left NATO. Very interesting. For now, they get to live. Everything had been building up to this. Maybe war could have been avoided, but the fall of Vietnam confirmed what Beria believed. The US didn't care about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness like it claimed to. It cared about its own ego and influence. America will stop at nothing to see communism die. If nobody stands up to the US now, the working class will be tortured for years to come. It's up to us to end American domination. We are more than ready. It was time to strike. We declared war on NATO, finally beginning World War III. I wasn't sure if I could micromanage 20 fronts at once, so I first focused on Turkey. We got good initial gains against the Turks with plenty of pockets. But then I noticed that NATO managed to land behind the front line. In fact, NATO did a fuck ton of landings behind the front line. This was very annoying since it meant troops often needed to be diverted from other fronts to deal with the landings. The invasion of Turkey was going well, but it had to be stopped because of NATO landing behind us, causing our supply lines to get fucked up. It started to piss me off a lot. After a while, I decided that the only way to stop NATO from invading us in most of the inconvenient places was to just invade the invaders. We called in more of the common form so we could launch the full invasion of Western Europe. On one hand, our highly capable forces were able to overrun West Germany and force them to surrender. But on the other hand, NATO managed to force Iraq to surrender. Because of Iraq falling to the west, we can't safely restart the invasion of Turkey until we liberate Iraq. I was real pissed with how many landings NATO was doing, so now I was even more determined to win. Our forces were able to successfully overwhelm the lowland countries with little issue, due to them becoming over-dependent on the United States for their defense. Earlier, I moved the mountaineers to Europe so they could deal with one of NATO's landings. However, I figured now that NATO was on the back foot, I could bring the mountaineers back to the Middle East to push out NATO's landings and finish off the Turkish. The main front in Western Europe went down much easier than I was expecting. After the lowlands and now Denmark fell, there was little that NATO could do to stop us from overwhelming France with our forces. Western mainland Europe was brought fully under Soviet control, and port garrisons were set up to stop future naval invasions. With the main front gone, we had a lot of freed up forces. We could use our freed up divisions to put down other invasions that NATO did. For some reason, the US also landed in Vladivostok. Luckily, we had more than enough forces free to respond to the US invasion. I moved my tanks to Greece to eliminate NATO's Balkan foothold. My allies in the region had already made progress, but once our tanks arrive, Greece will stand no chance. After a while, we managed to destroy the landing in Finland. Furthermore, the rest of the common forum was actually pitching in, and they managed to liberate Iraq from foreign occupation, and most of Iran was liberated from America. We were also regaining ground in the Far East, mainly due to the US dedicating too little to the invasion. After we went to DEFCON 2, we were able to fully liberate Vladivostok from America's half-assed invasion. I turned back to Turkey and Greece, both of whom were on the brink of collapse. I ordered my troops in Turkey to restart the offensive, and soon after, gave my tanks the green light to drive to Athens. Turkey surrendered sometime after, and soon after, we captured Athens. After taking some extra land, Greece threw in the towel. At this point, I was running out of fronts to fight on. I was expecting the main front in Germany to be much more heavily manned by the West, but it buckled after I began a basic battle plan. I finally called in Arabia so I could deal with NATO's foothold in the region, but even that went really fast. At this point, the US was completely humiliated. Despite several attempts to open new fronts, all ended in American men being knocked down forever. This war showed that the US was no more than a paper tiger that pushed around weaker powers as a show of force, while the actual superpower competently expanded its ideology. In fact, we were now more than ready to use our nuclear arsenal as we went to DEFCON 1. The remaining NATO countries collectively determined they had no chance of winning now, especially as the US completely destabilized. Anti-war protests were at an all-time high. The US officially sent in their request for an armistice on May 3rd of 1974. We gladly accepted, ending the Third World War. For the Treaty of Paris, we reunited Germany under the German Democratic Republic. We instated communist governments in the lowlands, Denmark, and France. We gave that Arab kingdom in a peninsula to our Arab puppet. The UK and Portugal were largely untouched, but the UK was forced to give up Northern Ireland to the Irish Republic, and Portugal had to give up their remaining colonies. The United States was forced to pay financial reparations to us. We didn't demand much from the US because the KGB agents present in America had reason to believe that several groups were planning uprisings against the federal government, so manhandling the US ourselves was silly. Beria's main goal of the war had been completed, so although the United States was left still standing, he was content. America had been completely humiliated. With how much money the US now owed the Soviet Union and how many protests and different movements were rising in the United States, the communist bloc no longer had any serious opposition. Everything was perfect. That, my friends, marks the end of this part of our adventure. I know you waited a bit longer for it, but that's because I had a bit of burnout after the last part, and this episode was bound to be big because it covers 25 years of gameplay, making it the most time-consuming to record yet. Regardless, I hope it was worth the wait. Don't go just yet though. There is one part left of the mega campaign. Speaking of which, I've decided we will do Red World instead of Red Dusk, simply because Red World makes a lot more sense given the context of the series. Alright comrades, For now, that marks the end of the great story of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. I'll see you in a week for the final part.